A while back, the second chapter of Sonic and the Blade of Courage dropped, a new Sonic manga about Sonic teaming up with a kid named Yuta and going on an adventure to save his friends after they all got turned to stone. It was cute, and I'm excited to see where the manga goes in the future. The thing is, this chapter of the manga, and the manga in general, isn't that notable at this point. It's not bad, it's quite good actually, but so little has happened so far that there's not much to say about it besides, well, it's cute and I'm excited to see where it goes next. At least that's what I thought. For some reason, a section of Sonic Twitter decided this manga was the second coming of God or something, because I saw a ton of people heaping praise on it. I was admittedly a bit confused by all of this, and when I talked to some of the people who were excited about this manga specifically, I started to notice a common theme. A lot of them were what I would describe as Japanese Sonic purists, and a lot of their praise for the manga was based kinda specifically on the idea that it was better than a lot of the American Sonic media that we had gotten recently. Now, if you don't know what that is, first off, I envy you greatly, but they're essentially a portion of the Sonic fandom who range from either saying that Japanese Sonic works have a different interpretation of the character and world that they prefer to what we're more used to here in the West, to people who claim that essentially most, if not all, non-Japanese Sonic material is outright bad, or not true to Sonic in some sense. This stuck out to me because this was a level of original text favoritism that I hadn't seen anywhere else in my time on the internet. I'm a bit of a weeb, and I've met a ton of people who swear by watching everything subbed rather than watching an English dub and talk constantly about how in the original Japanese version, but I've never seen a part of the fandom like hostile to the non-Japanese version of the material before. For instance, I've spent some time in the Ace Attorney and Danganronpa communities, and yes, the original Japanese versions of the games are a topic of discussion there, but no one will really care all that much if you stick to the more localized versions of the games, and that holds true for most communities I've been a part of with this kind of split between languages. This all led me down a bit of a rabbit hole to try and see what it was that was causing this divide in the first place, and what I found was, complicated, to put it mildly. I've gone ahead and taken the liberty of distilling the opinions of this portion of the community into 3 points that I think are the most common amongst them. 1, Japanese Sonic is the true version of Sonic. 2, Japanese Sonic is more consistent than American Sonic. And 3, Japanese Sonic has a different, superior characterization to American Sonic. I say American here specifically because the Sonic media that has come out of America has largely had the biggest impact on how the English-speaking world has viewed the character, so it's the one that comes up the most. Not to diss any Fleetway stans watching the video, but the Paramount movies and Archie Sonic have had a bigger reach overall. Before we begin, I need to give a quick disclaimer. The arguments I'll be talking about are sourced from various different people I've seen elaborate on these positions across various different platforms, and it would be wrong to assume that anyone who holds to one of these positions must therefore hold to the others. In fact, someone may agree with them to some degree, but have a slightly different take than the one I respond directly to. That's just the nature of the beast with this one. I'm going to be doing my best to respond to what I think is the most fair version of whatever argument I talk about, but it's impossible for me to cover literally everything, and I do have my own biases. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is just be normal about this, okay? With that, let's just go ahead and get started. 1. Japanese Sonic is the true version of Sonic. Now, this is a sentiment where the devil is really in the details. There are versions of this argument that I think are very mundane, all things considered. Some people will insist on referring to the original Japanese version of a Sonic script when trying to analyze it, and while I think this is maybe a bit overboard, it's not like there isn't a point. Most Sonic games are originally written in Japanese and then translated to English, and if you know literally anything about the localization process, you'll know that this tends to be a bit messy. It's very rare that things can be translated one-to-one, and this leads to a number of discrepancies between the original script and the localization in basically any case where a work is translated. From what I know, these discrepancies are even worse when trying to translate between a Latin language and a language like Japanese because the sentence structure and stuff like that is just different between them. When making arguments about things like authorial intent, referring to the script that was actually written directly by that author rather than the translated version of the script is a lot more helpful. I think people who insist on playing Sonic games in Japanese as a result of this are kind of cringe. It's a relic from the anime community back when the localization process for most animes was actually truly ass. A lot of older anime were done so dirty by the localization process that you do actually have to watch them sub to get anything even close to the original version of the story. But not only has the entire industry gotten a lot better about localization and dub quality over the years, this issue has not really existed to the same extent for Sonic games specifically. I'm not going to say that the localization for all the Sonic games were great or anything, but they're at least accurate enough to the original Japanese that you're not going to get an entirely different plot line or anything. By the way, I'm talking specifically about the games, which I did look into a little bit. I don't know about Sonic X. I heard that one actually had a really bad dub. Really, the biggest issue with the dubs of early Sonic games are the actual voice acting and sound mixing and stuff. They just did a really bad job with that for a few years. But by the time we get to the mid-2000s, most Sonic games can be experienced in English without missing anything. That's not to say that nothing is lost in translation or that looking to the original Japanese isn't helpful, but similar to most anime nowadays, the way you should interact with this media is mostly down to personal preference. That was a bit of a digression, but it's all to say that there is an extent to which I understand this criticism. I think people go overboard with it, but yeah, in a lot of instances I understand why this section of the community cares about the original version of these games' scripts. However, this isn't the only thing that someone can mean when they say that Japanese Sonic is the true Sonic. Sometimes this claim is phrased not as a literal statement about Sonic scripts, but is meant instead as a more ephemeral claim. Some Japanese purist types will assert that these Japanese scripts have a certain je ne sais quoi about them, something that not only isn't replicated in their English translations, but also not present in any English script for Sonic. This claim is a lot muddier and is also often bundled with various other claims that we'll discuss shortly. The way this argument usually goes is they start by gesturing at the differences between Japanese and Western Sonic, saying that these other differences make Japanese Sonic better for whatever reason, and then defending that claim by gesturing towards the fact that the Japanese scripts are the original version of the story. Often the claim that Japanese Sonic is better is left to implication, not outright said, but rather implied by this argument being used to dismiss parts of American Sonic canon. The exact way this argument works will differ from person to person, but the general underlying trend is dismissing certain takes on Sonic media by appealing to a mythologized true version of Sonic. The true version of Sonic in question usually being just whatever that person wants the franchise to be like, of course. This entire line of argumentation feels like a non sequitur to me. I happen to subscribe pretty liberally to death of the author, the idea that any one person's interpretation of a piece is just as valid as the person who created it. Considering that, it's probably not a surprise that I don't think that merely gesturing towards authorial intent in certain Sonic stories makes anyone else's opinion or takes on the franchise invalid. That's not to completely devalue the importance of authorial intent, but I think you have to use it to make an argument at some point. I don't really care about Yuji Naka or whoever else's ideas on how Sonic should be portrayed outside of chronicling the history of the character. Characters can and should change over time. That's how they stay relevant to our ever-changing world. Sonic isn't the same character he was back in 1991, and that's a good thing. Eventually, the reins on the Sonic franchise will have to be passed to new writers, game directors, and artists, and they'll use their own individual interpretations of the franchise to steer its course from there. This is all to say that eventually, not only will the franchise be reshaped by different artists without any connection to the original vision of the story in due time, but this has already happened over the 30 years of the franchise. Considering that this process is both inevitable and completely fine, I'm more than comfortable with people interpreting past games and events in the franchise in new ways. In effect, I think appeals to the history of Sonic as a franchise to determine how future games or media should portray the characters and world can often be less of an actual argument and instead just a rhetorical bludgeon. Rather than engaging with the actual arguments at hand, you can simply appeal to a supposed correct characterization of a certain character or something similar to never actually have to justify why that version of the work is more compelling. Of course, the history of the characters do matter to how they should be portrayed in the future, but that process is more complicated than they used to be like this, so they need to remain like this forever. And honestly, the idea that non-Japanese Sonic works inherently lack this special something that makes the Japanese versions better says a lot more about the person making the claim than it does any of the works themselves. I mean, just imagine saying this about literally anything else. Imagine saying that a non-American version of X-Men or any other comic or video game would inherently be missing something because the property was inherently American in some abstract, undefinable sense. It's something that I legitimately can't imagine saying, and I don't see why that would be any different in the other direction. I think the motivation for this claim more often comes from a bias towards Japanese works because Sugoi Nippon, or a bias against certain writers and ideas that simply masquerades as being about the cultures that created those works instead. 2/3. Japanese Sonic is more consistent / Sonic has a different personality in Japan. These are another pair of claims that I see from this sect of the community that kind of go together. Many quote-unquote purists, and I use that term kind of jokingly, claim that in the original Japanese, Sonic and other characters' personalities are far more consistent over time, and also different to the English versions. So before we start, we need to start by outlining what media this critique should and should not apply to. I think in general, this critique should only be applied to the actual Sonic games themselves, and I guess also Sonic X, but I still need to get around to watching that show sometime, so I'm not going to talk about it. Things like Fleetway or Archie Sonic were written in countries outside of Japan with the explicit purpose of creating a version of the character to appeal more to that country's general audience. The inconsistency between these different versions isn't a bug, it's a feature. America, the UK, and Japan all had similar but noticeably different takes on the character back in the 90s, and this was a deliberate choice by Sega. As such, the only apples to apples comparison we can make is comparing the portrayal of Sonic in media that was made in Japan with Sega of Japan's oversight and then translated into English. And this only really applies to the games. And also Sonic X, yeah, but I haven't seen it yet. And also 4Kids dubbed that, and they're famous for screwing up dubs, so you guys are probably just right on that one. I'll give it to you. So, as for if Sonic has been inconsistent in the games in America, I struggle to see how exactly this criticism could apply only to the majority of Sonic's English works. For this video, I spent a small amount of time watching more direct Japanese translations by Wendy Gaylord, who has an entire channel of translations of Sonic games that focus on sticking more closely to the original Japanese as far as I can tell. Before we even start, I just want to say that this is a really cool undertaking, genuinely. Like, we couldn't even be having this conversation were it not for the work put into these projects, and I can only imagine the amount of effort it takes to make one of these videos, so no shade being sent to these guys at all. And I do have to caveat this by saying that I have not watched all of these translations because there are just a lot of Sonic games and that would literally take weeks of my time, but of the few that I did watch, I watched them while checking the official English cutscenes for comparison, and there's no difference here. There are some slightly noticeable trends in how the characters talk between regions that I'll discuss a little bit more, but the meaning of most dialogue remains exactly the same in English and in Japanese. Maybe I just missed all of the places where they screwed up Sonic's character in the localization process, but as far as I can tell, the scripts are pretty faithfully translated outside of the standard changers and mistranslations that you'll find in any localization. They're obviously not perfect, but I think the authorial intent of the original scripts largely shines through. And that makes the claim that Sonic is inconsistent only in the West and not the original Japanese, far more suspect. How, if the scripts are reproduced faithfully in English, could there be inconsistency only in the English version? Well, I may have lied a little bit. You see, there are a couple of games where the English and Japanese vary wildly in terms of script. For example, look at the difference between the English and Japanese versions of this scene in Sonic Colors.
よかったね。ジェネレーターは全部壊したし、もう安心だよ。思ったより簡単だったね。
まったくだ。お前があれこれやってくれたおかげさ。
僕が？そうかな。確かに機械を改造してウィスプたちの言葉を分かるようにして話を聞いてたからソニックは行ったり来たりしなくて済んだけど、やっぱりソニックの方がすごいよ。
Thank you。どっちにしても俺たちは頑張ったわけだ。
With all the generators destroyed, we could blow this joint and head home. We did it, dude.
We? I don't remember you fighting off any insane robots.
True. Well, good job to you on inventing a translator that allowed us to speak to the aliens and figure out exactly what we needed to do so we weren't running around the park looking like idiots. Oh no, wait. That was me.
Good point. Either way, we can get out of this crazy place and go home.
This is one of the only instances I could personally find where the meaning of a conversation was just completely changed in the translation, and it's a pretty big one. Sonic Colors and Lost World are kind of infamous in the community for having awful stories, and a big part of that is that people hated how these games handled Sonic and Tails as characters. And a lot of the reasons why are shown in this clip. Sonic putting down Tails' competence for no reason, and Tails being a sassy little shit back to him about it. It just doesn't feel like them. The Japanese, on the other hand, feels a lot more in line with how these characters have acted in the past. So this is a Japanese purist W, right? This is an example of Sonic being out of character in the English version of a script while he remains consistent in Japanese. Well, there's a bit more to it than that. You see, Sonic Colors and Lost World are also infamous in the Sonic community for bringing on two writers that really didn't know how to handle the Sonic IP very well, at least in my and the general community's opinion. Pontac and Graf were hired to push the series in a more lighthearted, comedic direction after the previous games were lambasted for being so melodramatic, and they technically did do that. They just also made the game's story suck. This is important because, as you may have noticed, these guys are not Japanese. This was one of the many times that Sega contracted work from overseas on something for a Sonic game, in this case, the script. This means that the English here is the original version of the script, and as far as I can tell, the Japanese is the translation of their work. At least, that's my theory for what happened. Both Colors and Lost World have an additional writer credited outside of Pontac and Graf. Yasushi Otake worked on Colors, and Harumasa Nakajima is credited for Lost World. I really hope I pronounced their names correctly. Unlike Pontac and Graf, who information is readily available about, I had a bit of time tracking down much about these guys, but from what I can gather, they're employees at Sega who write for a lot of their games, as opposed to being contracted out for these projects like Pontac and Graf were. There might be more information on the exact writing process for these games, but I honestly can't be bothered to go check. I've already spent like a week researching this video. The point is that the English version of Colors is original. It's possible that the Japanese and English scripts were created at the same time by the entire writing team, as opposed to one being finished first and then translated to Japanese or something, but I'm not privy to how this went down. What we do know for a fact is that this discrepancy isn't caused by a mistranslation from the Japanese script. From what I can tell, the script is like this thanks to a deliberate choice by Sega to change how Sonic was written in the West to appeal to a more general demographic. Remember, this was a lot closer to the disastrous release of Sonic 06, and the games before Colors were largely following in that more serious direction, and the majority of the West hated it. This was peak Sonic fucking sucks actually era, or at least the precursor to that point in the cultural zeitgeist. Generally speaking, America and Europe didn't like serious Sonic and wanted him to be goofier, so that's what Sega delivered. However, for whatever reason, they didn't seem to feel the need to rebrand Sonic's image as thoroughly in Japan, so the characterization stuck more closely to what it had originally been. This isn't even getting into the boom era and that whole mess, which I believe was also largely a product of trying to rebrand Sonic to be more popular overseas. So, what's the point here? Doesn't this just mean that it's true that Sonic is inconsistent in the West versus Japan? Well, I mean, yeah, if all you want to do is take the world's smallest W, you can claim that, but what's actually happening here is a lot more complicated. Every dedicated Sonic fan I know of fucking hates Sonic Colors and Lost World Story, and wishes that even if Sega needed to pivot Sonic's marketing at the time, that they could have at least gotten someone who knew the source material to write the scripts for them. While it is technically true that this rebrand did make Sonic less consistent in America, it's only in the two games that literally everyone already hates and already knows are bad. You're not going to be changing anyone's mind by pointing out that Sonic is out of character in the two games written by people who didn't know anything about the franchise and that everyone knows Sonic is out of character in. I feel like the more accurate takeaway is that Sega had spent some time in the 2010s struggling to figure out how to get people in America to like Sonic and jerked his character around in Western media for a while as a result, when all they actually had to do was stop making shitty Sonic games. Like seriously, we got a few good movies and like 3 decent to good games in a row, and it feels like everyone is chill with Sonic again. It wasn't that deep. Just stop releasing your games before they're finished, Sega. The argument I'm dancing around here is that, while I might agree in some sense with the observation that Sonic is less consistent in English media overall, I think the reason for why isn't just because glorious Nippon does Sonic better than America or whatever, it's due to specific financial concerns relating to the IP at any given time. If you simply prefer some of the Japanese versions of Sonic media because they largely dodged this weirdness, that's okay, but I think accurately diagnosing the problem here is important. Now, that's the first half of this claim covered, but there is another side that I haven't interrogated yet. Specifically, that Sonic and many other characters have very different personalities or characterizations in the original Japanese. I think this is mostly bogus, but not like completely untrue. I feel like people really exaggerate this one. Outside of the places where we've already talked about the reasons why Sega felt the need to rebrand Sonic, most of the scripts are, as I said earlier, pretty much identical to the English versions in Japanese. The differences are so minute that I think you have a hard time telling the difference between the Japanese or English version of a script if they were both translated to the same language. However, I do think that there are some small differences in play, as the localizers seemed to want to emphasize certain aspects of characters at certain points. For example, Sonic himself seems to have like a couple of differences between the English and Japanese versions. It's pretty difficult to put into words because most of the lines are simply the same idea with different words depending on the exact way you translate them, but the connotation of what Sonic says is different in some Japanese lines than in English. The closest I can come to putting a specific phrase on this pretty ambiguous trend is that in the English localizations, Sonic is just ever so slightly edgier. He has more of an attitude. He's slightly jokier and sometimes a bit more mean. All of these things are also present in the more faithful translations of the games I've seen, but the original English scripts lean more into that aspect of Sonic's personality. Other similar differences exist with other characters. The localizations also tended to make Knuckles a bit dumber as a joke, but again, this is all within the bounds of normal localization practices. The meaning of all of the individual lines is usually maintained, it's just that the exact way the character goes about saying things pushes certain traits over others. Still, the characterizations between them are so similar that I don't think I would call either version out of character. Now that I've actually gone ahead and written out all of these arguments, I will say that I understand where people are coming from a bit more than I did beforehand. The entire thing does still feel like it's been overblown, but there will always be differences between the localized versions of a work, and there will be ensuing arguments in certain circles about which translations are more accurate. My only real issue is the people who go really overboard with this whole thing, going from simply enjoying certain works and having their own preferences to beginning to insist that they have the correct interpretation, or even worse, directly calling out members of the staff, particularly the IDW Sonic team, and being extremely shitty towards them. So this is the part where the video is going to get a lot less fun, but I did want to talk about this side of the discourse. I didn't bring this up before talking about the actual arguments because I didn't want to color your perception of the topic by simply pointing to the worst people with this opinion and acting as if they represent the entire community. That could very easily give someone the wrong impression, I feel. I mean, that was my first exposure to this topic, and it certainly colored my view of it at first, which is why I spent so long mulling things over writing this video. I'm not going to name names right now, but there was a hit piece made about Ian Flynn not too long ago that heavily relied on Japanese Sonic purism to make its arguments, on top of a number of other dishonest tactics that I believe is currently the most popular piece of media on the internet spreading Sonic purism. It even eclipsed Pariah's video on Japanese Sonic that's actually about this topic. As someone on the outside looking into this community and its state of affairs, I was initially worried that this entire discussion was just a smokescreen for a bog standard hate campaign. I mean, when I first heard these points, they were being used to simply slander someone, and I thought that the complaints themselves were entirely baseless, so it was easy for me to assume bad faith on the part of those who were making them, considering that they were actively attacking people at the time. So I spent some time trying to locate exactly what the source of these complaints were. And I can say that from what I see, I don't think this is some sort of astroturfed discourse. In order to manufacture outrage like this, you sort of need a captive audience. You need a platform where you can deliver the narrative over and over for a long period of time, and I wasn't able to find where that platform would have been. In fact, what I was able to find while looking for people discussing the topic were a lot of small discussions popping up in random places, on random sites, many predating the most popular examples of people using this as a tool for harassment. I even saw several people with this position specifically calling out people who use it as a way to be shitty and telling them to cut it out. I can't say for certain where this complaint is coming from, but if I had to guess, I think this is more likely to be a natural reaction from Sonic fans to the fact that some Sonic media has had some pretty shitty localizations. The closest thing I've ever seen to a similar situation play out is in the anime community, where there's been a long history of completely garbage dubs that ruin the source material. Combining that with the Sonic community's signature style of being extremely weird is probably enough to get the strange, violent reaction to American Sonic that we have today. Not to mention other factors like Archie Sonic being controversial and Archie Sonic fans themselves also being quite annoying at times. Still, in saying that, I don't want to completely discount the fact that there are people using this rhetoric as a Trojan horse for just being an asshole. I think the main reason for this is that the IDW staff is generally pretty well liked in the community and also openly quite progressive. And if you're a right-wing loser who gets angry at the existence of gay characters in media, you're pretty low on ways to slander them. So if you want to try and turn a segment of the community against these writers for your weird culture war bullshit, pretending to care about true Japanese Sonic is probably the easiest angle of attack. To be extremely clear, I am not saying that everyone who I would call a Japanese Sonic purist is a right-winger, or that it's even largely associated with those political beliefs at all. As much as I disagree with the video, Pariah's video on the topic doesn't lean into any of this at all, and I'm completely unaware of him doing so on any other platform. Most of the purist types I've personally talked to are also completely normal people. I don't think that the Japanese Sonic community, or whatever we want to call it, attracts these kinds of people or has an issue with harboring them generally. I just think that this is the easiest thread for dishonest actors to pull on, which honestly just sucks. The research I did for this topic was really interesting, and there's definitely a lot of room to have a productive conversation about these topics. It's just that the well has unfortunately been poisoned by a couple of asshats who've decided that this is the easiest way to get the queers out of Sonic or whatever. And while we're adjacent to the subject, I do think the entire community should stop attacking individual writers as people for their work on the franchise. I've seen people say some really terrible stuff about like Kin Penders or Pontac and Graff for the failings of their writing, and just, guys, we have to be able to criticize something without saying that you want to literally commit crimes against the person who made it. Genuinely, if Sonic Colors makes you that angry, you need to seek help. Anyway, that's where I'm going to end this discussion for now. Big shout out to all my members: Elric111, Agent B7, Bokabara, Sonic Storm, Joseph Florium, Shredding Pixels, and GB484.